So I just purchased the Bluetti AC180 for an incredible deal. And not only is that one solar generator going to replace all three of these, it's also going to replace my gas generator for all of my boondocking needs. Two parts of the video today. First, I'm going to just talk a little bit about my experience in the past with solar panels and solar generators. And then the second part will be a quick review of the AC180. This won't be a super technical review, hooking up watt meters and everything else. We'll simply go over the features, and I'll talk a little bit why I chose to buy this particular model. If you want some of those real technical tests, so you can look at the efficiency and everything else for yourself, I'll leave some of the links and some of the folks I watched in my initial research when I was making the decision to buy this Bluetti. My experience with solar power and solar generators really came with the purchase of my first travel trailer. Now, when you buy a travel trailer, typically you're going to get a wet battery or what we call a lead acid battery. Now, the issue with those batteries is you can only use 50% of their capacity. And the reason for that is once you discharge below 50%, you're actually doing damage to the battery. So it didn't take long before I upgraded the battery to a lithium battery. Now, the cool thing about lithium is you can actually discharge them to 0% without doing any damage. So basically with the same 100 amp hour battery, one being lithium, one being a wet battery, I now could use 100%. I then wired in a 190 watt solar panel, and that provided plenty of power for the core systems on my travel trailer when we weren't hooked to shore power. But it did leave a gap, and that gap was the fact that we still needed AC power. So I had to make a choice. Either I wired in an inverter and I used the battery that was on board, or I looked for something different. And that's when I discovered solar generators. Now these are basically power banks and inverters and solar chargers and a battery all in a tiny little box, which means I can directly hook up a solar panel and charge these things. And I've used this one in particular, the original Bluetti. This one has been phenomenal over the past 4 years. I haven't had any issues with it whatsoever, and it has powered a lot of our low power needs. And the reason I say low power is because all of these are only 300 watt. This one is pretty nice because it is 600 watt hours. These two are about 280 each watt hours, but I would typically have to carry all three of these to power things like my DVD player, my PlayStation 5, Starlink, and just some of the low power requirements that we had. Unfortunately, it didn't take long that while we were boondocking, we still wanted to have the ability to use high wattage devices like our microwave, or for my wife, having the ability to use a blow dryer. Both of those are pretty high wattage demands, and these boxes certainly can't handle that. So we ended up also having to buy a gas generator. Now, if you ever used gas generators, they can be very finicky, and unfortunately my Westinghouse i2500 generator had a catastrophic failure and was no longer operable. Now, I happened to be camping during that time, so I ripped it apart. I smelled like gas. My neighbors were complaining that they smelled the gas. So for me, it really sealed the deal to again go on Amazon and take a look at what was available. Lo and behold, what did I stumble upon? Well, the Bluetti AC180. So without further ado, let's jump right into some of the key specs. Some of the key specifications are it's 1800 watts continuous and 2200 watts peak. It has 1152 watt hour capacity, and it can take up to 500 watts of max solar input. It features a fast charge from 0 to 80% when you're using the AC plug and plugging it into a household outlet. This thing also charges pretty fast with solar. I noticed that I was taking it from about 50 to 100% in a little under an hour and a half. It features 4 USB 3 amps and 1 USB-C with a power delivery of 100 watts. It also features some extra modes, one of which is a UPS mode, an uninterrupted power supply. So for example, you could use it at your house connected to your computer, and if your power does go out, it will kick over to the Bluetti without your computer shutting down. The other feature that I really like is the power pass-through. This gives it the ability to send power from a solar panel or from an external source directly to your load, and then take any other remaining power and push it towards charging the battery. It does have some downfalls, however. Being in this mid-range, it is not that expensive as compared to a lot of competitors. So that included not making this waterproof. It has less inputs that some of its counterparts have, and especially compared to some of its bigger brothers. It has lower powered USB ports, no other DC ports other than the cigarette lighter, nothing like barrel ports or something that we can plug into. It lacks a touchscreen, and the app is pretty good, but in terms of management, it's rather limited. I do understand why they kept back some of these features just to keep the cost down so they could pass that along to savings to the consumer. And in fact, I don't really miss any of these features. It has all the core things that I need for my use case. So those are some rather impressive specs, and in a way, I'm super glad my gas generator broke down, or else I would have never gone back into researching these to see if I needed to upgrade. But because it did, I am super impressed with how far this technology has come in 4 years. We now have 1800 watts compared to 4 years ago having only 300 watts, and with a whopping 1152 watt hours. We also have an inverter built in, which is a pure sine inverter. And that's really important if you're going to power things like electronics in terms of computers or even camera equipment. You don't want to have what we call dirty power. Two of those key specs that I really like are first and foremost the ability to do power pass-through. And what that simply means is I can hook up 100 watts of solar power to this. And let's say I have a load on it that's only 50 watts. Well, what it's going to do is it's going to pass through 50 watts directly to that load and power it, but also use that other 50 because we have 100 going in to charge this. So in my instance, I use it a lot with Starlink. Now Starlink draws an average of about 50 watts when you're using AC power. Now if I plug this in and I have that 50 watts going to Starlink, I'm basically in a net positive because I'm using 50% of the power to on the fly and on demand power the Starlink, and then I'm using 50% of the power to go back in to keep this topped off. And another thing that's really important about that is as long as you don't drop this below 80%, it doesn't count as one of the charges. And we have 3,500 charges from 0 to 100, and that's the expected lifespan of this battery bank. So keeping it above 80 will just help to extend the battery life and your usage time for the Blue Yeti. Of course, it goes without saying that 1800 watts, well, that's going to power any needs that I have either on board my travel trailer or any of the peripherals that I bring. In a pinch, I could even charge my battery by hooking this up to my travel trailer. You'd simply just buy an adapter, 120 volts to 30 amps, and that will be able to hook directly to your travel trailer, run all of the internals, as well as charge your battery. I did test this with a portable heater, and if you know anything about heating with electricity, it's super inefficient and it takes a very high amount of watts. So for instance, my portable heater is 1800 watts. This thing didn't even blink to power it. In fact, I saw some surges up to 2100 watts and it handled it like a charm. No overloading, no cutoffs, no nothing. I also like this display. The display shows you the input, it also shows you the output, the charge level, and then of course, how much time you have left on the battery according to the load that's applied to this. And that's probably my favorite feature on this display, is the fact that it gives me that estimate of how much time I have based on what I have plugged in. And if I don't feel like looking at that display, it also has Bluetooth where I can connect the Blue Yeti app. Now this is super convenient, especially if you are boondocking, because let's say it's raining outside and this is down below, or you're in bed and it's nighttime. Well, then you can simply use the app to either monitor this, manage it to an extent, as well as turn it off. Now I will mention that you're not going to be able to turn it on when it's off via the app. It has to be on to connect to the Bluetooth. The other watch point here is if you leave this on and this power button is glowing, you're actually going to be drawing energy because it does have an onboard BMS. That's super important just because it is going to make sure this stays healthy and that you're not doing anything like putting too much into it or pulling too much out of it. Now, I will say it lacks some of the real modern features. For instance, a touchscreen. We don't have high power USBs, and we don't have a lot of them. We only have one USB-C. Most of the bigger boxes or steps above, they actually have a few more features as well as a few more areas to plug in, greater capacity, even greater wattage. But you're going to pay for that. And that brings me to my final point about this. I purchased this for $579. To put that in perspective, in 2020, I purchased the first Blue Yeti and I paid $600 for that. So now I'm paying less than my original box and getting a lot more power and a lot more capacity. And I think if you are in the market, now is a phenomenal time to buy, because I suspect they're no longer making these. And the reason I say that is because less than a year later, we now have an upgrade to the AC180. Now that's going to give you a larger capacity on the battery itself. And I do strongly believe, because of the upgraded model, these are going to go quick. So if you're in the market, you should definitely grab one. This right here represents so much to me and my wife, because we absolutely hate being out in a wonderful, beautiful place and still needing internet because we work from the road. And in order to do that, we'd have to put the gas generator to work. And anybody who's been around a gas generator, it's constant. That's just not pleasant when you're in some of the most beautiful places in the world. Not to mention, if you are in an RV park or a state park or, a federal park, you're going to have other campers around you. And that just simply means that you have to be quiet, typically from 10 p.m. to about 6 a.m. You can't run your generator. And if I can't run my generator, that means I can't power my Starlink. So this is going to give me a solution that hopefully during the day, I plug in my solar panel, it stays topped off. I don't dip below that 80% threshold. And because I have a 200 watt panel, on a decent day, I'll get at least 150 watts out of it. I'm going to be running Starlink basically at no energy cost. Overall, that's a win for us, because even though it is fairly loud for what it is in terms of a fan inside to keep it all cool, it's way less intrusive than any sound of a gas generator. Well, I hope you found value in this. Please consider liking and subscribing. I'm Hill Phantom. I'll see you next time.